Okay, good morning. So we're doing today Lamed Amud Beis. Well, we are up to Lamed Amud Aleph, about 5 lines up from the wide lines, where it says Tanya Idach. So again, as we said yesterday, we were going over a variety of brises that tell us a little bit about um, the different minhagim that people had. Eventually, at the end of the page, we'll get to sort of what we actually do today. So we're not having wine or eating meat or any of this stuff, but people at that time were still doing that. There were certainly um, customs that we're not accustomed to. So the Gemara says, Tanya Idach, Erev Tisha B'Av lo yechal adam shnei tafshilin. On Erev Tisha B'Av, a person shouldn't have two tafshilin. Lo yechal basav lo yishte yayin. A person shouldn't eat meat and he shouldn't drink wine. Divra Meir. So what does it mean? He shouldn't have two tafshilin. He shouldn't have like two cooked foods. A person should change from what their normal custom is. It should have less meat and less wine. What is the way that you diminish the amount that you're having? If a person is having normally a litra is like a liter. I don't know if the liter is used in solids, not just in liquids, but whatever a liter measure is. If somebody normally ate that much of meat, let him eat half of that. If he normally drinks a certain measure of wine, let him drink less than that. But if he doesn't have a custom, he's not somebody who's eating meat or drinking wine, then it's awesome to do that at all. If a person normally finished his meal and he had a radish or some salted food, then he is permitted to do so. So this is this brisa. I wanted to spend a moment over here. So we said, number one, that a person is not supposed to have shnei tafshilin. But and the brisa explained that what does that mean? Shouldn't have basar, shouldn't have wine. This is Rav Meir's position. I'm not so interested in the substance of it so much as I am in the tesis here for a minute. And the tesis on Erev Tisha B'Av Adam based tafshilin. A person is not supposed to eat on Erev Tisha B'Av two tafshilin. He shouldn't have meat. He shouldn't have wine. Remember, this is not from Rosh Chodesh. This is not Shvuah Shel Chalbai. It's interesting. Just if we take Rameir's Shita for a second, go back to what we had before. If you remember, Rameir held that Rosh Chodesh v'ad Taanit. Rameir held that there was these laws in play, right? There was different opinions as to what the Isser is. So the Bryce had said that we had yesterday, Chav Tesman Beis, the Taanit Tisha B'Av Shechal Dias B'Shabbos, V'chein Erev Tisha B'Av Shechal Dias B'Shabbos, V'echav V'shes Kol Tzorech HaMalav Shechon Afil Kisur HaShlom B'Shaytei, V'asol L'Sap L'Chabes, Mei Rosh Chodesh V'ad Taanit Divrei Meir. Meir held, and there were two versions of the Bryce, and both versions of the Bryce, in the second version when it says, V'tanya Idach V'noeg, Evel Mei Rosh Chodesh V'ad Taanit Divrei Meir. So Meir held that there was an end to all these restrictions on Tisha B'Av, but the restrictions started on Rosh Chodesh. Not everybody held that. If you remember, we had another opinions there. Right? We had the opinion of Rabbi Huda said it was Kol HaChodesh was Aser. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said the whole Shavua Shechalba it was Aser. But the opinion of Rabbi was it was Aser from Rosh Chodesh until Tisha B'Av. This over here is in addition to that, right? This position of Rameir is saying Erev Tisha B'Av lo yachal adam shnei tafshilin lo yachal basar lo yishta yain div Rameir. This is not something that's Aser from Rosh Chodesh on Tisha B'Av. This is Erev Tisha B'Av, an additional restriction according to the position of Rameir. According to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, we said that Shavuot Shel Chalbai, it's Aser both before and after Tisha B'Av. So now we're having another position from Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. It says, Im haya ragel echal tznan amelech achas sudasai harishus biyadei. Right, this is an additional point that we're learning about him that we wouldn't have necessarily known, but at least it doesn't contradict. But with the opinion of Rameir, it sounds like not that it contradicts, but it's an additional restriction. There is one level of restriction, Rosh Chodesh v'ad Tisha B'Av, and then on Erev Tisha B'Av, there's a separate restriction of lo yachal basar v'lo yishta yain. Sounds like there's something specific on Erev Tisha B'Av. So I want to just focus on the tesis because Taisa discusses this idea of Shnei Tafshilin. What is Shnei Tafshilin? So Taisa says, perish. Beis Tafshilin, Ratzulema B'Shtei Kedeiros. Two Tafshilin and two Kedeiros. So when you saw it, when we said Shnei Tafshilin, you thought what it meant like, you have two foods and you put them together, that would be usher. Taisa says, no. Shnei Tafshilin is in two different pots. You have one pot cooking one thing, another pot cooking something else. That we would call Shnei Tafshilin. But if you have some sort of a dish that's made of onions and cheese and eggs, I have no idea, it sounds gross, but whatever sort of a custom they had to eat this, I'm sure it was a delicious dish in their day, no problem. Why? People don't eat raw onions. It's not delicious. And in fact, the Gemara says in Erevin has quotes that those that they're very harmful for a person. It's like gives you, stabs you, it hurts you. So Tais nevertheless says that that's not going to be called a Shnei Tafshilin. Why? Because you're mixing a whole bunch of things together. That's not Shnei Tafshilin. That's one Tafshil, right? So then Tais concludes over here, and we'll skip to the end of the Tais. And Tais says that it doesn't have teres bishul, something can be eaten raw. So the two different points here in Taisa. The first one we mentioned already about the Shnei Tafshilin should be in Shtei Kederis. But if you take one kind of food and mix with another kind of food and you cook it together, that's not a Shnei Tafshilin. That's one thing. Then Taisa says that we're not going to call something which is eaten raw that it can be eaten totally raw. Like it's no issue to eat it. You don't have to eat it cooked. So we're not going to call it. That has no teres bishul. Klal says. Now, I'm not exactly sure what Taisa needs to do with this endem teres bishul klal, but I'm reminded of a tesis that we had in brachas. Right, tesis in brachas on Lamed Chesem base. Tesis said that something about apples. Over here, tesis says that apples can be eaten raw, and he says it doesn't have mishum teres bishul. And over there, tesis also talked about tapukim, and tesis said that apples, like kidneys, like some other foods, are eaten when they're chai k'moshehem mevushalin, umevushalin k'moshehem chai. They can be eaten in any manner. They can be eaten raw, or they can be eaten cooked. And in that case, I just want to make the argument that there was no difference in the bracha then. Right? This is very relevant when it comes to eating fruits or vegetables. Right? If you eat a raw, I don't know, apple, right? You make a what? Eighth. What happens if you eat apple juice? You make a shaka. What happens if you eat a baked apple? What bracha would you make? Right? What happens if you have a pumpkin? A pumpkin, what bracha do you eat when it's raw? You don't, right? It's a weird thing to eat. But if you ate raw pumpkin, what would you make a bracha? Shahaka. Why? Because it's not something that's eaten chai. You only eat it when it's cooked. That's the only way to eat it appropriately. Right? So it's not nechal chai k'moshe mavushal. So there you make a bracha shahaka, and when it's cooked and prepared in an appropriate way, then you make a hadama. But an apple, which again, to me, this was maybe a right that they ate a lot of baked apples. And if I tell my kids I'm making baked apples, they'd be like, well, that's so weird. Nobody eats baked apples anymore. Maybe not. But at least in Tyson's time, it sounds like they used to eat cooked apples the same way they ate them raw. And so therefore would potentially have the same bracha. Again, over here, what he means exactly with that, it doesn't have a teres bishul. I'm not sure exactly. I think I have to do probably with our conversation before about the two kederis. All right, moving on. So again, we had this another brayso that told us about different customs that they had on Erev Tisha B'Av. So on Erev Tisha B'Av, we had the additional opinion of our mayor, even though there was a separate issue from Rosh Chodesh to Tisha B'Av, there's a separate issue on Erev Tisha B'Av. The person shouldn't be having wine or meat. And the Chacham who don't disagree fully, they say you should change something. You should make it more limited. If you make it more limited, that's okay. In other words, the mayor is saying you can't have it. I'm saying you can just have less. And then the opinion of the Chachamim concluded the following line. It said, "V'im einay ragul kol ikar aser." But if you're not ragul to eat meat or drink wine, then it's aser. So it reminded me of a Gemara. The Gemara said, well, we had a little bit in Taanit, connecting the two together. So the Gemara says in Ksubis Samach, over there is a very interesting Gemara about woman and wine. I can't get into more now, but in the context of that Gemara, one of the things that the Gemara says is a story. Chaima, the wife of Abaya, came to the court of Rav and said, "I want you to give me wine. I want to be allotted an amount of wine to be drinking." So Rav says, "Why? I know that Nachmani didn't drink wine. Nachmani is the other name for Abaya, right? Because his parents died young, so it was like a condolence." So he says, "I know that Nachmani doesn't drink wine." Now, first of all, just to put it in context, remember the Gemara in the end of Brachas on Vav, the Gemara told us that Rava didn't pay Bar Hedya, the dream interpreter, whereas Abaya did. So Abaya got good dreams, but Rava got bad dreams. But in the end, Rava started paying him, and he got better dreams, better dream interpretations. All of it came true. And Rava says, "I forgive you for everything to Bar Hedya, except for the death of my wife, right, which was the daughter of Rav Chizda." But nevertheless, Rava lives after Abaya. Rava outlives Abaya. That's how this story in Ksubis could take place, where Abaya's wife, Chaim, is coming to the court and asking Rava to give her from his Abaya's estate money for wine or wine. So he says, "I'm not giving you any wine because I know Nachmani didn't drink wine." So she says, "What are you talking about? He used to give me wine, means a certain kind of a cup, a goblet." And she lifts up her arm to show what kind of ginormous goblets of wine he used to give her to drink. And so she's entitled to that. As a widow, she's entitled to that from his estate. So the Gemara says that she was so beautiful that when she lifted up her hands to show this cup, so her dress rose up on her arm, and like the whole base medrash was shining with the light from her skin. Right? The Gemara also said that about in the beginning of Brachas, right, on Ham and Bez, where Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar was crying when he picked up his hand to make some light in the room because his skin was so luminous and so glowing, right? So the Gemara says that unbelievable lines, amazing what it tells us about the Gemara, it tells us about Rava. The whole thing is too much to get into now, but he goes home and he's Tava with the Basra of Chizda. He's Taveh her. And she says, "What's my high? What's going on in the middle of the day? It's happening." So he says that Chayma came to the Bezdin. So he goes and chases Chayma out of town with an axe. She's like, "Get out of here. You already killed 3 husbands. Chayma was married to 3 men. Now you want to grab my husband too? No, you're out." That's the Gemara. So I thought to myself, Rava knew that Abaya didn't drink wine, therefore he didn't want to be passing wine to Chaim. He says, "You're not entitled to wine. That's not what your normal food is." When somebody's not rugil, right? In the case of what we're saying here, it's usher to be drinking to have any wine by Erev Tisha B'Av. And Rav is saying, why should we be taking money from Abaya's estate to give you for drinking things that you never drank when he was alive? It's not part of your sustenance. But she wasn't lying. She could have been saying the truth, and Rava could be also not lying, and he also could be saying the truth. How's it possible? To remind me of a Gemara, good chazar for us back in Taanit. Right, we had a Gemara at the end of the second parak. The Gemara was on your days, Amud Aleph. The Gemara told us. The Gemara told us where was the Gemara? The Gemara said, no, I'm sorry, it's the second parak. On the first parak, it was. Yeah, it was on Yudzayin. Yudzayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara said as follows, that because we say, we always want to have that the Beis Hamikdash is coming, and it could very well be that today Mashiach's going to come, be all of a sudden a third Beis Hamikdash. So we should be what? Always on guard, always be watchful, always be mindful. And one of the practical ways of seeing that is in terms of a kohen. That a kohen who's makir his mishmeres or makir his beis av, so he shouldn't be drinking wine during that week, during that day, when his time would be called because potentially, if the third Beis Hamikdash comes about, he could be called back for that time. And then we said in the Gemara, but what happens if somebody doesn't recognize who his family is? He doesn't know. He just knows he's a kohen. So it says the Gemara, if it's in a situation of what happens if it's in a situation of somebody who does not know? He doesn't know his Beis Av. He doesn't know his Mishmeres. He just knows that these Kahatain, that they were in the Beis Hamikdash. That's all he knows. So also lishtos yain kol hashana. He's also to drink wine a whole year. Rabbi Omer Ani also lishtos yain lo'elam. Really should be also to drink wine forever. Why? Because Meheri Yaveh, the Beis Hamikdash is going to be rebuilt. So you always have to be chaysh. You're going to need for that later today. So you shouldn't be drinking wine because a kohen who's is also to be a shaso yain, right? He's also to be a drunk. He can't do the avodah. What do the Gemara conclude over there? Is that Rabbi said, even though that's what it should be, it's not possible to keep such a takana. It's not possible. No one can manage. Remember, they used to drink wine a lot. Water was very dangerous a lot of times. So they drank a lot of wine. So you can't keep to such a thing. Amar Abaya, Kiman shasu ha'idna kahani chamra kerebi. How do the kahanim drink wine today? Because they're going relying on Rebbe. That takanta calculus, this is too hard. We can't abide by such a takana. Right? You're not allowed to make a gezer she'ein etzibi yechon lamad by. So we're not doing it. So what's Abaya saying? Abaya saying that really the law is you shouldn't be having wine. But we rely on Rebbe. Mizman for the people that they can't hold themselves back. Takanta calculus, and so we rely on Rebbe to be able to drink wine. It doesn't mean that Abaya himself drank wine. Abaya himself could have been machmir on himself and said, I'm not drinking wine, which is why Rava would say correctly that Abaya, who is a kohen, how do we know Abaya is a kohen? Because the Gemara Shani Yud Ches tells us that Abaya was a kohen from Beis Eli. And even though he was from Beis Eli and normally should have died young, and that was the curse to Eli, he didn't die at 40, like Rabbi, who was also a kohen. He died at 60. Why? Because the Gemara says about Abaya that he had Torah and Ma'asim Tovim, not just Torah. And that can potentially explain how it could be that Abaya didn't drink wine, and Rava was correct and said Nachmani didn't drink wine, therefore I should be giving you wine because I know he didn't drink wine, whereas she didn't lie either. And she said, no, I drank wine. She herself didn't have to be machmir. She was never doing a bud in the Hamikdash, and so of course he could have been feeding her wine as the amount that she said. But in any event, that's an example of a situation of v'im eina rago kol ikar asur, that somebody would not be rago to drink wine. It would literally be asur to have wine on Erev Tisha B'Av. All right, so Zot the Gemara. Tanya Idach, another brisa that tells us about the minhagim that they had. Tanya Idach kol shum mishum Tisha B'Av, anything that was asur because of Tisha B'Av. The Rashi says that we're talking about the Suda Mafsekes, meaning anything that you're going to be doing during the Suda Mafsekes to sort of come into the fast. So also le'achal basar v'asur l'stisan. So also by the Suda Mafsekba, by the Suda Mafsekes to have meat or wine. But also lirchitz and it's also to wash up. Kol she'eina mishum Tisha B'Av. Anything that's not because of Tisha B'Av, and it's this different understandings. I'm going here with the Rabbeinu Gershom. So if you look at the bottom, the Rabbeinu Gershom says, what does it mean? Kol she'eina mishum Tisha B'Av. That means it's for other fasts. In other words, it's not like a law that you have to have a Suda Mafsekes by a fast that is starting in the morning. You don't have to. But if somebody's going to have their last meal before another fast, not necessarily Tisha B'Av, so then mutar la'achal basar l'shis yayin ve'asur l'irchitz. So according to the Tanakama, it will be mutar to have meat and to drink wine, but it's also to still wash. Rabbi Shmuel bar Yosi, I remember Shem Aviv. Rabbi Shmuel bar Yosi says the name of Rabbi Yosi. Kol shosh mutar la'achal basar mutar l'irchitz. No, whenever it's mutar to eat meat, it's also mutar to wash your face. So again, two different opinions as to. I'm here focusing now on the Tisha B'Av aspect. And forget the other aspects. The Tanakama had said that when you're doing the Suda Mafsekba, so then it's also to drink wine, also to eat meat, and it's also to wash your face. Says the what he calls says Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosi in the name of his father that if it would have been mutter to eat meat, then it would have been mutter to wash. right? But if it's asr to eat meat, then he agrees that it's asr to wash. And so the question would then become, what happens if it's the Suda, which is not mafsik, but you're just eating, an Erev Tisha B'Av, not the Suda mafsaka. So according to this brisa, according to the Tanakhama, you would still be allowed, right? The Erev doesn't, it's not limiting here to Erev Tisha B'Av saying that it's asr. It's saying Kol Shem Mishum Tisha B'Av, meaning it's only by the Suda mafsik that it's going to be asr. So if you're having another meal, let's say before 6 hours or whatever, you happen to be eating meat or drinking wine. So according to the Tanakhama, then that situation, right? Or another fast. It's not a result of Tisha B'Av. It's not Sudam Afsikba. So then you could eat meat and drink wine. But according to the Tanakhama, it would still be usher to be rachat, pan of viraglov, etc. Pan of other viraglov. And according to Shor Rabbi, no, if you're able to eat meat, you are able to be washing up as well. Fine. Another brayse, Tana Rabbanan, kol mitzvahs hanahagas be'avel nehagas b'tisha b'av. Any mitzvahs which are naeg with an avel are also naeg on Tisha B'av. What does that mean? So, as Rashi points out, we do very different things than an avel does, right? By Tisha B'av, we're not eating. An avel has no issur on eating, right? So Rashi explains that we don't mean to say that it's identical. There are certain very common themes that you find in Avelis that you find on Tisha B'Av, but Tisha B'Av has additional things as well that you won't find on a regular Avelis. So what does that include? So again, those things, right? These other types of inuim are also to an avel, but achil shia is obviously mutter to an avos. It's just usher on it's just usher on Tisha B'Av. But these other things of Seicha and Yilsa Sandal and Tashu Shemit, that's usher to both by Avelis Yishana of Tisha B'Av and Avelis Chadasha of a regular avel. Also likros b'Torah b'Neviim u'Ksuvim, and it's also to read Tanakh on Tisha B'Av. Right, it's the one time that the Yetzer Hara to learn, right? On Tisha B'Av, like I just want to learn, right? No, not allowed to. Village knows the mission of a Talmud of Medrash. It's not goodness. You're not allowed to learn Gemara. You're not allowed to learn Medrash. I will carry with Markham Shani Baruch Likrais. Right, but you're allowed to read the areas of Tanakh that you don't know. Why? Because as Rashi says, because that's a tsar. When you're learning something that you don't know, that's tsar. So I'm not sure if that means if you learn with an art scroll, if it's tsar, because then maybe it's taking away the tsar. But if you're learning a sugya, according to this Manda Amar, right? Since you're going to be breaking your teeth on it and you don't really know it, so then you can do it on Tisha B'Av. And you can learn Gemara if you don't know the Gemara. The Kari Bikinis, and you're allowed to read all the Kinas. Remember, they had Kinas going back for a long time. Right? They had already Kinas back then. David HaMelech said Kinas. So the Kinas have been around for a long time. Obviously, we add to it all the time. We added now October 7th Kinas, right? There's always, unfortunately, more lamenting that we can always add. But the fundamental point that you're supposed to learn things that are not going to bring you to Simcha, that's the takeaway from here. And that, according to this Mandam, again, we don't hold like this halacha, but according to this Mandam, meant that you could even learn stuff that you're just not used to learning. As long as you don't know it, that's going to cause you some desire to learn it. So then you could do it. You could also read the Kinais. You could also read Eiv. Right? Eiv is obviously a book where the man has, aside from the first few lines, the man's having a horrible, horrible experience. His whole life is ruined. The whole thing is questioning God. So the idea of studying Eiv is not studying Eiv merely for the idea that Eiv had a horrible time and he lost his wife and he lost his whole family and he lost his money and he lost his health and all. And that takes place in the very first chapters of Eiv. That's not what's going on here. The reason you're allowed to study Eiv is because of all the questioning of God. Rabbi Soloveitchik very famously would say on Tisha B'Av every year that it's the one day of the year when you're permitted to say to God, why? Why are you doing this? How is this normal and fair? How is it reasonable? That's why it's Eiv, because that whole book is about Eiv and his friends debating about what is just. Is there justice? What's divine retribution? Does it fit? Does the punishment fit the crime? Yeah. With the Varim Haram Shabbayim, you're allowed to read all the bad stuff in Yirmiyah. It talks about the destruction of the temple. And and the kids have to stop learning, right? It's only one times of the year they have to stop learning. Also, obviously, Yom Kippur, Pesach, certain times the kids are not going to learn. So, and what's the reason that we don't have them learn? Mishum shenemar, Pekudei Hashem Yishar, Misham Chilek, right? The studying of Torah is exciting. So we don't want to be too happy on Tisha B'Av. Yehuda Aimer, Af and a Kuru Magshin and Ragaligras and a Shem Magshin and Ragalishnice, Avokaru Be'ev Kinis and Dharam Haram Shabiyim, V'tang Shabasham V'Talan, by Mishum Shnamar Pekudei Hashem Yishar Misham Chilek. So Rabbi Yehuda is essentially adding in the idea just that if somebody is not rugged to be kairi or not rugged to be shayna certain things, so then he shouldn't do it. Again, as we said, it's very similar to what we just said from the Tanakh. So when it comes out now, is that at least according to this brayta, there is a theoretical possibility to be learning on Tisha B'Av, but not something that would be easy to learn. Meaning, aside from the bad stuff that you can learn, which we do bring in down halacha, you could also read stuff that you don't know. We don't do that today. We do add that you could learn all the Agadat Gemaras in Gittin, right, to deal with the destruction of the base Hamikdash, right, stuff like that. Reading history books, reading books for the Holocaust, and obviously watching videos that every Jewish organization puts out. That's all now part of the experience of the modern day Tisha B'Av. But anything that brings you to a sad place, and that brings you to a place to feel the severity of the day, that is all going to be permitted. Yeah. All right. So let's move on. So the Gemara told us over here, a person is not to be having meat or drinking wine. Tana, we have another brayso. A person's allowed to eat salted meat and drink wine from his vat, like the yain chai, right? Not old wine. So the Gemara says, "Basam leachad kama." How long does the meat have to be salted for you to be permitted to eat it? Right? Because we basically are holding that when the meat is salted for a certain period of time, it sort of loses its taste of meat. I can't tell you, I didn't really understand it, but that is therefore the isser of saying you can't eat meat doesn't apply to basar maliach, because after being salted for some period of time, it's just not really meat anymore. It's something else. So the Gemara explains that Rav China bar Kahana Mishmei Shmuel calls man shehu. I look on the side. Calls man shehu kishlamim, meaning it's already been a couple of days in the salt. So once it has that amount of time, Shnei yom v'layla echa, basically 2 days in the salt. So then it kind of loses its taste anymore, and then you would be allowed to eat it. That's not when we say lo yochel basar. We're not including basar maliach, because the salted meat is just not having that same kind of taste like meat anymore. And what about yayin megita? So the more explains, what does it mean v'yayin megita at kama? How long is the amount of time for the wine? Pozman shu taisis, as long as it's fermenting. If it's fermenting, meaning it's new wine, it's still in the process of fermenting, so that is not really considered a good wine. So therefore, the isser of not having wine before Tisha B'Av, that's not going to be applicable to bad wine. That would be also permitted. Now the Gemara says the line that has practical ramifications. Halacha Tana yain taisis ein ba mishum gilui. Right, yain taisis, fermenting wine, doesn't have anything in terms of gilui. What is gilui? Right? Anyone know the Isser of Gilui in Shulchan Aruch here? There, Kuf Tezayin, very interesting, very different than the Torah. Normally, what does the Shulchan Aruch do? He's copying what it says in the Torah, what it says in the Rambam. But in Kuf Tezayin, your day, he does not. Right? We know the halacha. The Gemara tells us that you're not allowed to have certain things with Shem Gilui. Right? What happens if you have a wine that's left uncovered, or water that's left uncovered? Right? We're not supposed to drink that stuff. Why not? Because maybe the snakes came in and put in their poison. So we have to be careful from these things. Yeah. So the Gemara tells us, Yayin Taises ein bo mishum gilui. Yayin Taises, meaning fermenting wine, doesn't have any issues of gilui. Why not? Because of the fact that it is so disgusting, meaning, or I shouldn't say that, it's not maybe the right word, but it's so not tasty that even a snake doesn't want it. That's why you're allowed to drink it. There's no issue about it, drinking that kind of wine before Tisha B'Av. Even a snake's not going to want it. So you don't have to worry about gilui. If it was left uncovered, it's no problem. You can still drink it. Yeah. When Shulchan Aruch then, your deck of design, Shulchan Aruch says, look, even though this stuff is brought down in the halacha and the Talmud, we don't have these problems today. We don't really see snakes in our towns. So it's okay. there's no Gilui issue. Then the next halacha talks about meat and fish. I'm not getting into that, but it's one of those things that when I was a younger and more contrarian personality, I enjoyed rating on people on these halachas. But nevertheless, Shulchan Aruch says you don't have to be worried about Gilui. Have you ever met people that are worried about Gilui? That's because the Pesach Shuv brings down the Shlah. So I rely on this, so I can't fight with it. But nevertheless, says the Shlah that somebody who's Baal Nefesh should be still machmer on Gilui. And Pesach Shuv says, and I also hear that the Chassid, the Gra, he was also machmer on it. Which to me I don't really understand because in the beer it doesn't say anything about it. So I don't know. But nevertheless, says the Pesach Shuv, that's what he says. But the clear black letter law is from the Shulchan Aruch, which is that today these things don't apply, and says the Gemara that on Yayin Taisis, even in the days that it did apply, this issues of Gilui, they weren't worried about it because the wine itself was in such a fermenting stage that it would be a turnoff to all the snakes. Continues the Gemara comment to Tisa Gimel Yamim. How long does it ferment? It's 3 days. This is now the halacha that we are all familiar with. Rabbi Huda bar Rabbi did the following. This was his minhag, and we learn from this minhag. This is what we do. Erev Tishbav mevin lePascha revo melach. They would bring him a very dried up bread with some salt. V'yoyshev, turn the page on the lamina of base. Bein Tana l'kirayim. He sat in the bad part of the house between the ovens. Right, all the ash and all the soot and all the disgusting. He would sit there. And would have a little bit to drink. And he was like somebody who was mesa was mutalafan. That's how he prepared for the fast, and that is in fact how our Yehuda Hamafsekes looks like is following the custom of Yehuda Bar Eloi. Finds out the Gemara Tanan Hasam, another Raisa tells us we all should know this who did brachas Yud Zayin, the very same Gemara, literally identical Gemara Tanan Hasam Magam Shnag Latzim Lachem Tesbav Eisen. Places that have a custom to do the work on Tisha B'Av, they are allowed to. Places that have a custom not to, they shouldn't do work on Tisha B'Av. And in all cases, Talmidei Chacham are not allowed to work on Tisha B'Av. A person should make himself like a Talmidei Chacham and not work on Tisha B'Av. Person should make himself like a Talmidei Chacham. They sheyitz anet, so they should be, feeling the suffering, should feeling the tsar of Tisha B'Av. You just point out that in that Gemara brachas Yud Zayin, if you remember the Gemara was the context of saying Shema, right? On the night of the chasana, somebody's marrying Msula, and the chasana is tired with the inyanim of that night, so he doesn't have to say Shema. And the what do you call that? Somebody who is taking upon himself that because doesn't want to be missing Malchus Shemayim for even a moment. The question was that Mexi Kiyara or not? So Tais over there says that even though we say that Moshe Gamliel says that everybody has to make himself like a Talmid Chacham, and when it comes to Tisha B'Av, and that means that everybody has to make themselves like a Talmid Chacham. When it comes to Tisha B'Av, that they shouldn't what? Be working. Nevertheless, we don't say that when it comes to Shema, that a person should make himself like a Talmid Chacham and not say Shema. What do you mean? Because it says we don't have Kavanah today. No one reaches the level of Kavanah. So if a Chassan is not going to say Kriya Shema on the night of his Chasana, we're going to say you are Baal Gaiva. Because you're intimate and you actually have Kavanah. Whereas we say we never have enough Kavanah. So if you never have enough Kavanah, and therefore we should say Shema, we're not going to be making ourselves like a Talmid Chacham with regards to this. And you are going to now not say Shema. You're a Mexican. You are a show-off. So everyone has to say Shema. But on Tisha B'Av, when it comes to working, everybody has to be like a Talmid Chacham. Nobody should be working on Tisha B'Av as much as possible to avoid it. And I think more says some, things that can scare us into making sure that we don't work on Tisha B'Av. Anybody who works on Tisha B'Av is not going to ever see a sim bracha. Anybody who eats on Tisha B'Av is like they're eating on Yom Kippur. Of course, it's not true in terms of like the rice. It's not a chi of kares, but it's that kind of implication. You are, should understand the severity of your actions. Anyone who doesn't feel the availus of Yerushalayim is not going to see the simcha of it. And the Gemara understands that by definition, if you're working on Tisha B'Av, you're not being Misaba on Yerushalayim. And therefore, you will not be around to see the resurrection, the Mashiach, the Third Beis Hamikdash, etc. Yeah, let's just finish up quickly. So the Gemara says, "Shenem Simcha Yerushalayim Megilu Bakol Aveh Sisu Aisach Mesois Kol Amasablam Maleo Mikan Amru Kol Masabal Yerushalayim Zeicha B'Rei B'Simchas." Anywhere, everyone who is Masabal Yerushalayim is going to be Raya. The Simcha Yerushalayim She'enim Masabal Yerushalayim anywhere B'Simchas, and if they're not Masabal Yerushalayim, they will not see the Simcha. Tanya Namiyachi Kol Eichel Basar V'Shes Yayin V'Tes Ba'av. Anybody who's eating and drinking on Tisha B'Av, their sin is being brought on themselves. All right, let's just look at the Tosfos quickly. The top Tosfos on the page. The Tosfos tells us, Tosfos says, a person has to very much limit the mitzayir himself and take away his hanois. If a person normally sits on two cushions, it should on one. But it doesn't apply to Uber Sheminikis. I'll be the next Gemara. They're not required to do this. They don't have to even style themselves like to this degree. And then Tais says, we eat the sunnah mafsekes while it's still daytime. We do it, say to on Erev Yom Kippur, we eat the sunnah mafsekes while it's still day. So, and by Yom Kippur, it says, Sarach litzad by Yom, the Tais is Yom Kippurim and Atayr. You have to do that because Tais is Yom Kippurim is Menatayr. You have to do it for sure by day. But so too is by Erev Tisha B'Av, you do it while it's still the day. But you do not answer up drinking after the Sunnah of Sekas, and it's still daytime outside. Let's skip to the last few lines of Tosfos. If it's still daytime after the Sunnah of Sekas, muter lishtes the fila of Yom Kippurim, the kol shkein Erev Tisha B'Av. You're still allowed to drink water before the fast, even after the Sunnah of Sekas. It's brought down today in Halacha, though, that a person should have that in mind, that they still intend to drink. Once you make the bread, you make a Berachas Hamazon, they should have it in mind that you still intend to drink, or say it, that's even the best. But Tosfos is clear that since it's still being Ba'id Yom, that it would be mutter. Tosfos Damash, you have to make it as a Tanai, but we today try to at least make it as a Tanai. Shkach, have a wonderful Shabbos.